Hello fellow modelers, and welcome back to the channel. If you're just joining me, about a month ago I started this YouTube channel by posting my first build video. And after a long while trying to recover the painting and weathering files, I finally got them back. So here we are today, priming a black color from Mission Models. At the time I had no idea that I should have thinned the paint because it seemed like any thinner I used, namely IPA, just didn't do the job. So, with that said, unthinned Mission Models paint can sure destroy your airbrush, have consistency problems, and spray a splattery paint which leaves a weird texture on the tank. I also primed the metal parts with the same thinner. Some people like to prime before they prime with a metal primer, but I see no use in those, and the regular plastic primer seems to be okay for my purposes. Wow, that is probably the most times I've used the word primer in one sentence. That being said, I will admit that I haven't used the metal primer before, but again, I have heard of what it does, and I don't seem to have any problems with paint flaking off or anything like that. For some reason, I forget why, I didn't capture myself spraying the dark yellow onto the tank, for which I wholeheartedly apologize. But my next job was to outline every panel line in a dark brown color, which, for my first time spraying, instead of paintbrushing this step, I thought I did okay. Who am I kidding? I did horribly. I used a mix of dark rust, orange brown, and chocolate brown for the chipping color. Using a 3/0 brush, I filled in the lighter chips I made with a sponge. This process took the whole day, probably about 5 hours. It was very rewarding in the end to have the whole tank chipped up and ready for the weathering process. Hopefully in the future, I'll be able to chip faster, although I know I'm already going pretty fast. I know that you can use a sponge to make it go much faster, and I have used that in the past with some excellent results, but I like the control that I get with a brush better. I did use a sponge for smaller chips, but it was extremely controlled with this step, not even putting chips in the same spot twice. In my opinion, this effect came out very nicely, and the chipping process was one of the most rewarding and gratifying parts of this build. Next, I applied the decals, which, the tank I was building, there was only 2 of them. The identification numbers on the back, as you see here, and the glasses plate on the front. These decals were very nice, and I only had to apply 1 or 2 coats of decal setting solution to get them to stick to the surface of the tank without them actually looking like decals. This was probably because I was applying them to a flat surface with minimal carrier film. I like to highlight any bolt heads or raised details that are on the tank, which gives it a nice 3D effect. Realistic? No. Artistic? Maybe. Some of you may be thinking that I'm covering up the chipping on the bolt heads, which I'm not lying. You would be right. But again, I'm going for a more of an artistic approach rather than a realistic. My next task was adding mud to the lower hull. I started with a wet dark mud, which worked as an undercoat for the lighter and drier mud to follow. I used an really old brush. I probably went a little overboard with this step, but it turned out okay in the end. After I let that dry overnight, I started applying the dry mud over the dark mud. I definitely need to work on applying mud, especially to be controlled with it. I'm also thinking about adding more effects to the lower hull like grass and, mostly grass. By the time I was done, the lower hull was mostly covered in dry mud, which, again, I need to work on moderation in these steps, but after the mud, I applied streaking to the unhorizontal panels. Pretty much every panel that wasn't horizontal, so 0 degrees, no streaking, 1 degree, streaking. I also added rain marks effects from Ammo. They make some really great products for the modeler. It's too bad I'm not getting paid to say this. So anyway, I forgot to seal in the layers before this step, so my chipping kind of got streaky also. But oh well, I went back and fixed it after the fact. Coming back to the mud, I added, what's it called again? Pre-shading? But you're applying it after the mud, which would make it post-shading, but you can't use that word because it's already taken up for another painting step. I don't know. Let's just call it gradual mud. Maybe dust effects? Anyway, I applied this on the side skirts as well as some lower parts of the upper hull. After that, the second to last step was to add speckling to the lower hull and parts of the upper hull. I applied it with an old airbrush needle and paintbrush. The product I'm using is literally called Splashes, and it's from Ammo MIG Company. As the last step, I sealed in all of my work with a flat coat. I'm leaning now more towards not using a flat coat, but we'll see how it turns out. After I was done with this, I called it finished. I really enjoyed this model, and I think it's my best one yet. In the future, you can see me painting Andy's Sherman from Andy's Hobby Headquarters. I'll also tease a build and paint of a Russian vehicle from the winter of, let's say, 1941. There may also be a small vignette to go along with it. Only time will tell. That does it for this video. Farewell, fellow modelers, and Godspeed. After I let that dry overnight, I started applying the dry mud over the dark mud. I definitely need to work on applying mud, especially I'm also thinking about adding more effects to the lower hull, like grass and, well, mostly grass. Okay. Where are we? So anyway, I forgot to seal in the... Okay. So anyway, I forgot to seal in the layers. Before this step, so my chipping got kind of streaky also. But I went back.